In the late afternoon sun of Phoenix, Judge Samuel Carter adjusts his tie in front of the mirror. His office walls display numerous awards and certificates, recognition for 2 decades of work in civil rights law. The nameplate on his desk reads, Honorable Samuel Carter, District Court Judge. He checks his watch. 2 hours until the community center's annual justice reform meeting. Carter reviews his speech notes one last time. The pages detail statistics about racial profiling in Arizona, facts he knows by heart after years of ruling on civil rights cases. His phone buzzes with a message from the event organizers confirming his 7 p.m. speaking slot. At 55, Carter carries himself with the practiced dignity of someone who's spent a lifetime in courtrooms, though his eyes retain a spark of the public defender he once was. The judge decides to take a walk through Henderson Park before the event, something he often does to clear his head. The park sits quiet at this hour, with only a few joggers on the paths. Carter loosens his tie slightly in the lingering heat, his dress shoes crunching on the gravel path. Meanwhile, across the park, Officer Mike Johnson sits in his patrol car with his partner, Officer Stevens. They've received reports of drug deals in the area. Johnson, a 12-year veteran of the force, scans the darkening park with practiced eyes. At 34, he considers himself a good cop, tough but fair, at least in his own estimation. Movement by the south entrance, Stevens says, pointing to a figure in dark clothing walking alone. Johnson squints through the growing darkness. The description matches their suspect. Tall, African-American male, formal attire. They'd been tracking a well-dressed dealer who'd been selling to college students. Without running lights, they drive closer. Carter notices the patrol car but thinks nothing of it. He's a regular at this park, and the officers usually recognize him. But these aren't the usual patrol officers. Police! Stop right there! Johnson's voice cuts through the evening air. Carter turns, confused. Before he can speak, 3 officers approach rapidly, flashlights blazing in his eyes. Hands where we can see them, Stevens shouts. There must be some mistake, Carter begins, reaching for his ID. I'm Judge. He's reaching, someone yells. Everything happens in seconds. Johnson moves forward with his taser drawn. Carter tries to step back, hands raising. Wait! The taser prongs hit him in the chest. Electricity courses through his body. Judge Samuel Carter, who'd spent that morning ruling on a police misconduct case, falls to the ground. His body convulses as 50,000 volts override his nervous system. A scream echoes across the park, Carter's own voice, though he won't remember making the sound. His face presses against the cold ground as handcuffs click around his wrists. Through the pain and confusion, he hears fragments of radio chatter and realizes with stunning clarity that this moment will change everything. Johnson stands over the prone figure, adrenaline pumping, before reaching for the man's wallet. As he flips it open, the Judicial ID badge catches the beam of his flashlight. His stomach drops. Oh shit, he whispers, recognizing the face of one of Phoenix's most prominent judges. The park falls silent except for Carter's labored breathing and the crackle of police radios, all present, knowing that this night will have consequences that will ripple far beyond this moment in Henderson Park. The fluorescent lights of St. Joseph's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Judge Carter's face as doctors examine the taser burns on his chest. His judicial robe has been replaced by a hospital gown, his dignity stripped away along with his clothing. The emergency room buzzes with activity, but Carter notices how the staff keeps stealing glances at him. They know who he is. Local news vans already crowd the hospital parking lot. The story broke within hours. Prominent civil rights judge tasered by police in park. Carter's phone hasn't stopped ringing. Calls from fellow judges, civil rights attorneys, community leaders. His clerk has already fielded 17 interview requests from national media outlets. Dr. Martinez documents the burns, taking photographs for what everyone knows will become evidence. The burns are superficial, she explains, but we're concerned about potential cardiac effects. Carter barely hears her. His mind keeps replaying those moments in the park, the blinding flashlights, the shock of the taser, the cold ground against his face. Across town, Officer Mike Johnson sits at his kitchen table, still in uniform, watching the 11 o'clock news. His wife Laura stands behind him, hand on his shoulder, as the anchorwoman describes the incident. Johnson's photo appears on screen next to Carter's official judicial portrait. The contrast couldn't be starker. The decorated judge known for civil rights advocacy and the officer who mistook him for a drug dealer. The department has placed Officer Johnson on administrative leave pending investigation, the anchorwoman announces. Johnson's phone buzzes again. Another message from the police union representative. They want him to say nothing, admit nothing, but something inside him feels broken. Unable to sleep, Johnson drives to his friend Marcus Washington's house. Marcus, a community activist Johnson met during a police community liaison program, opens the door without surprise. "I saw the news," he says simply. They sit in Marcus's living room, the TV muted, but still showing coverage of the incident. "I didn't know who he was," Johnson says, his coffee growing cold. "But that's not really the point, is it?" Marcus shakes his head. "No, Mike, it's not. You're just starting to see what we've been talking about all these years." Back at the hospital, Carter receives another visitor, Reverend James Mitchell from First Baptist Church. The religious leader takes in the judge's condition, the medical monitors, the police officer stationed outside the door for his protection. "This isn't just about me," Carter tells Mitchell, his voice hoarse. "This is about every black man who's ever been stopped for existing in the wrong place. Only difference is, I have a title they have to acknowledge." The media coverage intensifies through the night. Cell phone footage from a distant witness emerges, grainy but clear enough to show Carter falling after being hit with the taser. Social media explodes with outrage. Justice for Judge. Carter trends nationally. Johnson watches all of this unfold on his phone screen at Marcus's house. Each new development feels like another weight on his chest. "I can't just hide behind the union statement," he finally says. "I need to do something." Marcus studies his friend carefully. "You need to decide who you want to be in this story, Mike. The system will protect you if you let it. The question is, should it?" As dawn approaches, both men remain awake in different parts of the city. Carter, finally alone in his hospital room, begins writing notes for what will become his public statement. Johnson, driving home through empty streets, rehearses words of apology he's not sure he'll ever be allowed to say. Neither man knows yet how their paths will continue to cross, or how this one night will catalyze changes that will reshape their city's approach to justice and policing. The hospital's conference room transforms into a makeshift press center 3 days after the incident. Judge Samuel Carter, still showing visible discomfort, but dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, faces a wall of cameras and reporters. His usually clean-shaven face now carries a shadow of stubble, evidence of days spent recovering rather than maintaining his usual routines. "What happened to me in Henderson Park?" Carter begins, his voice steady despite his hands gripping the podium. "Is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a systemic problem that plagues our law enforcement." He pauses, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "I've spent years ruling on cases of police misconduct from behind the bench. Now I understand these cases from a very different perspective." Reporters' hands shoot up, but Carter continues uninterrupted. "My title as judge shouldn't be what makes this incident newsworthy. Every citizen deserves the right to walk through a public park without fear of being profiled, assaulted, or treated as a criminal without cause." Across town, Mike Johnson sits in an uncomfortable folding chair at the Community Center for Social Justice. The weekly meeting, usually attended by a handful of activists, is packed tonight. Johnson, wearing civilian clothes, tries to make himself invisible in the back row, but he can't tune out the stories being shared. A mother describes her teenage son being slammed against a police car for matching a description. An elderly man recounts being forced to lie face down on hot pavement during a traffic stop. Each story hits Johnson like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality of a system he's been part of. Sarah Martinez, a longtime community organizer, notices Johnson's presence. Rather than expose him, she catches his eye and gives a subtle nod of acknowledgement. During a break, she approaches him. "It takes courage to be here," she says quietly. "I don't feel courageous," Johnson responds. "I feel like I've been blind." The meeting continues, and Johnson finds himself taking notes, really listening for perhaps the first time in his career. The stories start to sound less like complaints and more like evidence of a pattern he's been part of perpetuating. Back at the press conference, Carter introduces Maya Thompson, a prominent civil rights attorney and activist known for her work on police reform. She steps to the podium, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Judge Carter's experience has shed light on what our community has long known," Thompson declares. "But what makes this moment different is the opportunity it presents. We're not just calling for justice in this single case, we're demanding systematic change." Thompson outlines plans for a series of community dialogues, bringing together law enforcement, community members, and legal experts. Carter, still standing nearby, notices how she manages to sound both forceful and inclusive, angry about the system, but open to those within it who want change. After the conference, Thompson approaches Carter privately. "We need to use this moment," she says. "Your position, your experience, it creates a unique platform for change." Carter nods slowly. "I've spent years trying to effect change from the bench," he replies. "Maybe it's time to step into the community more directly." The day ends with two significant decisions. Carter agrees to work with Thompson on organizing the community dialogues, turning his trauma into a catalyst for reform. And Johnson, after sitting through the entire activism meeting, approaches Sarah Martinez to ask how he can contribute to the conversation about police reform. Neither man sleeps well that night. Carter lies awake thinking about how to translate his personal experience into meaningful policy changes. Johnson stares at his ceiling, remembering all the times he'd dismissed similar stories of police misconduct, wondering how many other times he might have been wrong. The local news closes with footage of Carter's press conference, played alongside clips from the community meeting. The city holds its breath, sensing that something significant is building. Not just a story of one incident, but the beginning of a larger movement for change. The community center's main hall fills beyond capacity for the first public debate on police reform. Metal folding chairs scrape against linoleum floors as volunteers add extra seating. Maya Thompson stands at the entrance, directing traffic flow, while Judge Carter reviews his notes at the podium. The air conditioning struggles against the heat of hundreds of bodies packed into the space. Carter surveys the crowd, noting the clear divide. One side predominantly filled with community members, many wearing Black Lives Matter shirts or holding small signs. The other side populated with off-duty police officers in civilian clothes, their postures rigid and arms crossed. The middle seats form a no man's land, nearly empty except for a few journalists and community leaders. "We're not here to point fingers," Carter begins, his voice carrying authority earned from years on the bench. "We're here to share experiences and find solutions." He describes his incident clinically now, stripped of emotion, focusing instead on the systemic issues it represents. As he speaks, photographs from his hospital stay project onto the screen behind him. The taser burns, the bruises from his fall, the official incident report. The first community speaker approaches the microphone. James Wilson, a 19-year-old college student, describes being stopped 14 times in the past year while driving to campus. His voice shakes as he talks about keeping his registration papers in a clear folder on his dashboard so I don't have to reach for anything. Officer Sandra Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the force, takes the microphone next. She talks about the fear officers feel, the split-second decisions, the weight of wearing the badge. Some community members start to murmur in disagreement, but Carter raises his hand for silence, insisting all voices be heard. Near the back of the room, Mike Johnson slips in quietly, choosing a corner seat where shadows partially obscure his face. He's not in uniform, hasn't worn one since the incident, but he carries himself like someone expecting confrontation. A few heads turn his way. His face has been in the news enough that people recognize him. Maya Thompson notices Johnson's arrival and signals subtly to Carter. The judge's reaction is barely perceptible, just a slight stiffening of his shoulders as he recognizes the officer who tasered him. The current speaker's words fade into background noise as Carter processes this unexpected development. Johnson feels the weight of Carter's gaze, but forces himself to stay seated. He takes notes, writing down each community member's story, each officer's perspective. When an elderly woman describes being terrified during a routine traffic stop, he watches his former colleagues shift uncomfortably in their seats. The tension in the room reaches its peak when Carter calls for final comments. Johnson raises his hand before he can stop himself. A collective intake of breath follows as people recognize him. Carter pauses for a long moment, pen hovering over his notepad before nodding in Johnson's direction. Johnson stands but doesn't move to the microphone. From his position in the back, he speaks loudly enough to be heard. "I'm here to listen. I'm here to learn. I don't have a statement to make, but I have a lot of questions I need to answer for myself." The silence that follows feels electric. Carter and Johnson lock eyes across the room. The judge and the officer, the wronged and the wrongdoer, both men now caught in the orbit of a movement larger than their personal conflict. Carter breaks the tension with a simple, "Thank you for coming, Officer Johnson." He doesn't smile, doesn't offer forgiveness, but his acknowledgement carries weight. The meeting concludes shortly after, but small groups linger, discussing what just transpired. Maya approaches Carter as the crowd thins. "Are you okay with him being here?" Carter watches Johnson quietly leaving through a side door. "His presence makes this real," he responds. "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about whether people can change, whether systems can change. If he's willing to sit and listen, really listen, that's where change begins." The janitor starts stacking chairs as the last participants leave, their conversations continuing into the parking lot. The next debate is scheduled for the following week. Nobody knows that it will become the setting for an even more dramatic confrontation between these two men whose lives have become inextricably linked by one moment in Henderson Park. The second debate ends with most participants filing out, but Judge Carter remains at the podium, organizing his papers. Mike Johnson stands from his seat, gathering his courage. Maya Thompson notices his intent and positions herself near Carter, protective but curious. "Judge Carter," Johnson's voice carries across the now empty room. "Could I speak with you?" Carter looks up, his expression unreadable. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across both men's faces as Johnson approaches the podium. Maya starts to intervene, but Carter raises his hand, stopping her. "5 minutes, Officer Johnson. That's all." Johnson stops a respectful distance away. "I've been trying to find the right words for weeks," he begins. "Everything sounds inadequate." "Because it is inadequate," Carter responds, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Do you know what it feels like to be face down on the ground, electricity coursing through your body, knowing that your life's work defending civil rights meant nothing in that moment?" Johnson doesn't flinch from Carter's words. "No, sir, I don't. But I'm beginning to understand what my badge has meant to people who don't look like me. Every story I've heard in these meetings, they're all talking about me, about what I've been part of. Outside the community center, protesters gather with signs reading, "Justice for Judge Carter" and "Reform Phoenix PD." News vans line the street, cameras rolling as the crowd grows. The protest, organized through social media, has drawn hundreds. Back inside, Carter circles the podium, closing the distance between them. "Why did you really come to these meetings, Johnson? Looking for forgiveness? Trying to save your job?" "I came because I need to understand. That night in the park, it wasn't a mistake. It was exactly how we're trained to react. And that's the problem." Johnson pulls out his notebook, filled with stories from previous meetings. "Every person who's spoken here, I've written down their stories. I keep thinking about how many times I've been that officer in their stories." The tension in the room shifts slightly. Carter studies Johnson's face, seeing something beyond the uniform for the first time. "Understanding isn't enough," he says finally. "What are you going to do about it?" Before Johnson can respond, Maya interrupts with breaking news on her phone. Someone leaked body cam footage of the incident. The video plays, crystal clear. Carter walking peacefully, the aggressive approach, the taser deployment, Carter's scream. Social media explodes. Phoenix police brutality trends nationwide. The protest outside swells as people share the video. Carter watches the footage, his hands gripping the podium until his knuckles turn white. Johnson watches too, seeing himself in the video with new eyes. "I look like a predator," he says quietly. "We all do, escalating a situation that never needed escalation." Carter's phone buzzes continuously. Calls from national media, civil rights organizations, politicians sensing an opportunity. The video has transformed a local incident into a national conversation. "The department will try to contain this," Johnson says. "They'll say it was an isolated incident, blame it on poor lighting, unclear protocols." "And what will you say?" Carter challenges. Johnson straightens his shoulders. "The truth, that this isn't about one night or one mistake. It's about a system that turns officers into occupying forces in our own communities." Outside, the protesters begin chanting Carter's name. The judge gathers his papers, preparing to address the crowd, but he pauses, turning back to Johnson. "Actions, Officer Johnson, not words. If you're serious about change, prove it." As Carter exits to speak to the protesters, Johnson remains inside, watching through the window as the judge becomes a symbol of resistance. His phone buzzes, a message from the police union warning him to stay quiet. He deletes it without reading the full text. The night ends with Carter's speech to the protesters being broadcast live across national networks. Johnson watches from inside, still holding his notebook full of stories, understanding that he stands at a crossroads. He can retreat into the safety of the system that trained him, or step forward into uncomfortable truth. The video continues to spread, forcing Phoenix and the nation to confront what happened in Henderson Park. But in that community center, two men have begun to see beyond the viral moment to the deeper changes needed. Changes that will require both the courage to speak and the humility to listen. The federal courthouse looms over downtown Phoenix, its marble steps crowded with reporters and cameras. Inside courtroom 304, Judge Samuel Carter sits not at the bench but in the witness chair. His attorney, Patricia Rodriguez, one of the country's leading civil rights lawyers, stands before him. "Could you describe, Your Honor, the departmental policies that enabled this incident?" Rodriguez asks, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. Carter leans toward the microphone. "The Phoenix Police Department's use of force policies create a culture of escalation. Officers are trained to dominate every interaction, to meet perceived non-compliance with immediate force." He pauses, adjusting his tie. "I've reviewed hundreds of these cases as a judge, but experiencing it personally revealed how deeply flawed these policies are." Across town, Mike Johnson stands before 20 fellow officers in a conference room at the West Precinct. A PowerPoint slide shows statistics on racial profiling. We need to confront our biases, he tells them. Not just acknowledge them, actively work to change them. Some officers shift uncomfortably. Others glare openly. Sergeant Matthews, a 20-year veteran, stands. You turning on us, Johnson? Trying to save your own skin? Johnson meets his gaze. I'm trying to save all of us. Every time we abuse our authority, we destroy the trust we need to actually protect and serve. He clicks to the next slide. Carter's hospital photos. This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern we can't ignore anymore. Back in the courtroom, Carter describes the psychological impact of the incident. I've spent decades telling people to trust the system, to work within it for change. That night in the park showed me how fragile that trust is, how quickly it can be shattered by officers who see threats instead of citizens. The police union lawyers object, but Judge Ramirez overrules them. Carter continues, his voice growing stronger. Every time I walk past a patrol car now, my heart rate increases. I find myself planning escape routes in public places, and I'm a federal judge. Imagine how ordinary citizens feel. Johnson's presentation ends with half the room empty, officers walking out in protest. Those who remain include younger officers and a few veterans troubled by recent events. Officer Sarah Chen raises her hand. How do we change things when the whole system resists change? We start with ourselves, Johnson responds. We document everything. We speak up when we see abuse. We refuse to be complicit. He shares his notebook, filled with community stories. These are our neighbors, not our enemies. In the courthouse, Rodriguez presents evidence of systematic discrimination. Years of data showing racial disparities in use of force, traffic stops, and arrests. Carter's testimony provides the human face to these statistics. Your Honor, Rodriguez asks, what changes would you like to see implemented? Carter leans forward. Mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight committees with real power, body cameras that can't be turned off, but most importantly, a fundamental shift in how officers view their role in the community. The day ends with both men exhausted but resolute. Carter's testimony will continue tomorrow, diving deeper into specific policy recommendations. Johnson faces an internal affairs investigation for his reform advocacy, but more officers are beginning to question their training. That evening, Carter receives a call from the Attorney General's office. They're considering launching a pattern or practice investigation into the Phoenix Police Department. Johnson gets a different call. Anonymous threats from fellow officers warning him to remember which side you're on. Both men lie awake that night, understanding that they've crossed points of no return. Carter's testimony has transformed from personal grievance to systemic indictment. Johnson's advocacy has marked him as a traitor to some, a pioneer to others. The local news leads with split-screen coverage, Carter's powerful testimony beside Johnson's internal reform efforts. The story has evolved beyond a single incident into a catalyst for institutional change, though whether that change will come through courts or culture remains to be seen. In their separate homes, both men review their notes for tomorrow. Carter prepares to detail decades of judicial observations about police misconduct. Johnson outlines plans for a new training program, knowing it might cost him his career. The city watches, wondering which force will prove stronger, the momentum for change or the resistance to it. A new security video from a nearby building surfaces, showing another angle of Carter's tasing incident. The footage reveals 3 officers laughing afterward, one mimicking Carter's fall. The video hits social media at 9 a.m. By noon, it's on every major network. Carter watches the footage in his chambers, his hands clenched into fists. Maya Thompson stands beside him, watching his reaction. This changes everything, she says quietly. The department can't claim this was just procedure anymore. They were enjoying it, Carter responds, his voice barely controlled. All these years on the bench, I gave officers the benefit of the doubt. I believed in proper procedure, in the system. He turns off the screen. I was wrong. Across town, the police department holds an emergency meeting. Mike Johnson sits in the back, recording everything on his phone. Chief Williams paces at the front, face red with anger. This department is under attack, he declares. We need to close ranks. Johnson raises his hand. Closing ranks is what got us here. We need transparency, accountability. That's enough, Johnson. Williams cuts him off. You've done enough damage. This bleeding heart routine might play well with the activists, but we know what you're really doing, trying to save yourself at our expense. Several officers nod in agreement, but Johnson notices others looking down, uncomfortable. He stands, addressing his colleagues directly. Look at the video. Really look at it. Is this who we want to be? Is this why any of us joined the force? The room erupts into chaos. Officers take sides, some defending the status quo, others expressing doubts. Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, suddenly stands. Johnson's right. My kid asked me yesterday if I ever hurt innocent people. For the first time, I couldn't answer. Meanwhile, Carter takes the stage at a national civil rights conference in Washington, D.C. The audience includes lawmakers, activists, and media from across the country. He speaks without notes, his words carrying the weight of personal experience. The problem isn't just the officers who abuse their power, he tells the packed auditorium. It's the system that protects them. It's the culture that turns every citizen into a potential threat. It's the training that prioritizes dominance over de-escalation. Back in Phoenix, Johnson faces an internal affairs investigation. The charge, conduct unbecoming an officer, for his criticism of department practices. He sits across from investigators, his union representative conspicuously absent. Officer Johnson, do you understand that your actions are damaging department morale? The investigator asks. I understand that my silence would damage something far more important. Public trust, Johnson responds. He pulls out his phone, playing recordings of other officers discussing how to avoid body camera accountability. The investigator's face is pale. The day reaches its climax when both stories converge on national news. Split-screen coverage shows Carter's powerful speech alongside footage of Johnson being escorted from the precinct, his badge and gun confiscated pending investigation. Social media explodes with support for both men. Stand with Johnson trends alongside Jocker Justice for Carter. The narrative shifts from a single incident to a larger movement for police reform, with Carter and Johnson emerging as unlikely allies. Late that night, Johnson receives a text from an unknown number. Check your email. He opens his inbox to find dozens of videos and documents from fellow officers, evidence of systematic misconduct they've been afraid to report. Carter, returning from Washington, sees the news about Johnson's suspension. He calls Maya. Get me a meeting with him, he says. It's time to combine our efforts. The day ends with both men facing personal costs for their stands. Carter's judicial colleagues suggest he's become too activist for the bench. Johnson's career hangs by a thread. But the movement they've sparked continues to grow, fueled by new evidence and emboldened voices from within the system itself. Local news closes with a powerful image. Johnson's empty locker at the precinct, his nameplate removed, while across town, Carter's courthouse office fills with letters of support from across the country. The contrast highlights the price of speaking out and the necessity of doing so anyway. The federal courthouse's security lines stretch around the block as Carter prepares for his final testimony. Inside, the gallery overflows with national media, civil rights leaders, and community members. Judge Ramirez peers over her glasses at the packed courtroom. Your Honor, Patricia Rodriguez addresses Carter. Please explain to the court how this incident reflects broader departmental policies. Carter straightens in the witness chair. What happened to me wasn't a deviation from policy. It was policy in action. Officers are trained to view every hesitation as resistance, every movement as a threat. The department calls it command presence. In reality, it's state-sanctioned intimidation. The police department's lawyers object, but Judge Ramirez waves them down. Carter continues, his voice steady. I've reviewed thousands of police reports in my career. The language is always the same. Furtive movements, refused to comply, appeared aggressive. These aren't objective observations. They're trained responses designed to justify force. Across town, Mike Johnson faces a panel of superior officers. Chief Williams sits center, flanked by internal affairs investigators. Officer Johnson, this is your final opportunity to retract your statements and maintain your position with the department. Johnson looks at each face on the panel. I have evidence, he responds, pulling out a USB drive. 3 years of incident reports where force was used without justification, body camera footage that was supposedly lost, text messages coordinating cover-ups. The room temperature seems to drop. Chief Williams leans forward. Think carefully about what you're doing, Johnson. Some things can't be undone. That's exactly the point. Johnson stands, placing the drive on the table. I've already sent copies to the FBI, the Justice Department, and select media outlets. You can fire me, but you can't bury this anymore. Back in the courthouse, Carter describes the psychological impact on communities. Every parent of color teaches their children how to survive police encounters. Think about that. Not how to trust officers, but how to survive them. I've spent years trying to change this from the bench. Now I understand it needs to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. The testimony breaks for lunch. Outside, protesters hold signs reading, "End qualified immunity" and "Police the police." News helicopters circle overhead as Carter emerges, surrounded by supporters. Johnson's meeting ends with his official termination. As he turns in his badge and gun, fellow officers line the hallway. Some turn their backs, but others, more than expected, nod in respect. Officer Chen steps forward, handing him a thumb drive. "There's more," she whispers. "A lot more." The afternoon session begins with surprise testimony. Johnson enters the courtroom, approaching the witness stand. Carter watches intently as his former assailant raises his right hand to be sworn in. "Officer Mr. Johnson," Rodriguez begins, "please tell the court what you observed during your 12 years with the Phoenix Police Department." For the next 2 hours, Johnson methodically details systemic abuses, backed by documentation. He describes quota systems for citations, informal contests for use of force, and deliberate targeting of minority neighborhoods. The police department's lawyers frantically object, but the evidence is overwhelming. Chief Williams, watching from the back, leaves halfway through Johnson's testimony. His resignation letter hits the mayor's desk before sunset. As the day ends, Carter and Johnson find themselves at the courthouse steps, surrounded by media. A reporter shouts, "Judge Carter, do you forgive Officer Johnson?" Carter faces the cameras. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about accountability and change. Mr. Johnson could have protected himself by staying silent. Instead, he chose to protect his community by speaking truth. Johnson adds, "I lost a job, but I found my conscience. Others will follow." The evening news leads with footage of both men descending the courthouse steps, not as adversaries, but as unlikely allies in the fight for reform. Behind them, more officers step forward, inspired by Johnson's testimony, ready to break the blue wall of silence. The day closes with a small gesture, Carter extending his hand to Johnson. Their handshake, captured by dozens of cameras, becomes the symbol of possible transformation, not just of a department, but of the relationship between police and the communities they serve. The courthouse falls silent as Judge Ramirez returns from deliberation. Carter sits with Maya Thompson and his legal team, while Johnson occupies a solitary seat in the second row, now a civilian in a suit rather than a uniform. In the matter of Carter versus Phoenix Police Department, Judge Ramirez begins, her voice cutting through the tension. This court finds substantial evidence of systematic civil rights violations. She adjusts her glasses, reviewing her notes. The incident involving Judge Carter represents not an aberration, but rather a manifestation of deeply problematic departmental policies. The victory feels momentary, as Carter's team quickly realizes this is just the beginning. Outside, protesters continue their vigil, their numbers growing as news of the decision spreads. But the real bombshell is yet to come. Johnson approaches the stand for his final testimony, carrying a thick folder of documents. The police union lawyers shift nervously. They know what's coming. "Mr. Johnson," Rodriguez begins, "please tell the court about Operation Clean Sweep." Johnson opens the folder. Clean Sweep was a departmental initiative that never appeared in official records. Officers were instructed to increase stops and searches in minority neighborhoods, with unofficial quotas for arrests and citations. He produces internal memos, text messages, and statistical analyses. The goal wasn't public safety. It was generating revenue through fines and civil asset forfeiture. The gallery erupts in murmurs. Several high-ranking officers quietly leave the courtroom. Johnson continues, describing how officers who questioned these practices faced retaliation. They'd get dangerous assignments, no backup when called, their complaints lost in the system. Carter watches Johnson intently, seeing not the officer who tasered him, but a man dismantling his own profession to expose the truth. The cost becomes clear as Johnson reveals the threats he's received. Dead rats left on his porch, brake lines mysteriously cut, anonymous calls in the night. "Why come forward now?" Rodriguez asks. Johnson looks directly at Carter. "Because what happened in Henderson Park opened my eyes." But it wasn't just that moment. It was watching Judge Carter's response. He could have settled quietly, taken a payout. Instead, he chose to fight for systemic change. I realized I had to do the same. The testimony continues as Johnson methodically exposes years of cover-ups. He names names, provides dates, presents evidence. Each revelation lands like a body blow to the department's defense. During a brief recess, Carter approaches Johnson in the hallway. "They'll come after you hard for this," he warns. Johnson nods. "They already are, but someone has to stand up. Might as well be me." The day reaches its climax when Johnson reveals the existence of an internal database tracking officers who report misconduct. They call it the Problem Children List, he explains. "Once you're on it, your career is effectively over. I'm probably at the top of it now." Judge Ramirez leans forward. "Mr. Johnson, do you understand that this testimony could result in criminal charges against your former colleagues?" "Yes, Your Honor. That's precisely why it needs to be said." The courtroom falls silent as Johnson details specific instances of retribution against whistleblowers. Each example builds the case for not just reform, but complete departmental overhaul. As the day ends, news breaks that the Department of Justice is launching a full investigation based on Johnson's testimony. The police chief announces his immediate retirement. 3 deputy chiefs take sudden leave. Carter watches the aftermath unfold from his chambers. Maya brings him the latest developments. Officers coming forward with more evidence. Community leaders calling for citizen oversight committees. Politicians suddenly eager to support reform. "It's really happening," she says. Carter nods, but his expression remains serious. The system won't go down without a fight. Johnson just painted a target on his back. The evening news shows Johnson leaving the courthouse through a side door, surrounded by federal marshals for protection. His testimony has transformed him from department pariah to key witness in what's becoming the largest police corruption investigation in Arizona history. The day closes with both men under protection, their lives irrevocably changed. But as Carter reviews the court transcripts and Johnson secures his evidence in a safe location, both understand that the real battle, implementing actual change, is just beginning. Judge Ramirez delivers the final verdict in a courtroom so packed that officials set up video feeds in adjacent rooms. Her ruling is comprehensive and unequivocal. The Phoenix Police Department must undergo complete structural reform. This court orders the following. She reads from her decision. Immediate implementation of civilian oversight committees with subpoena power. Mandatory de-escalation training. Complete revision of use of force policies. External review of all officer-involved incidents. And most significantly, the department will operate under federal supervision for a minimum of 5 years. The gallery erupts until Ramirez's gavel restores order. Carter sits with perfect posture, his expression neutral, though his hands tremble slightly. Johnson, now wearing a suit instead of his uniform, watches from the back, surrounded by federal marshals. The ripple effects are immediate. By sunset, the police chief and 3 deputy chiefs have resigned. The mayor announces an emergency session to discuss departmental restructuring. The police union, for the first time in its history, issues a statement acknowledging the need for reform. After the verdict, Carter finds Johnson in the courthouse parking garage. "What now?" Carter asks, their breath visible in the cold underground air. "I've been approached about heading up a new police reform organization," Johnson responds. "They want to use Phoenix as a model for nationwide change." He pauses. "They want you on the board." Maya Thompson joins them, carrying a thick folder. "We've already got funding commitments from major civil rights organizations. The goal is to create a template that other cities can follow." The next morning, Carter holds his final press conference as a sitting judge. The media falls silent as he approaches the podium outside the courthouse. "Today, I'm announcing my retirement from the federal bench," he begins. "My experience has shown me that real change requires more than courtroom decisions. It requires active engagement in our communities." He outlines his plan to join Johnson's new organization, the Center for Police Reform and Community Justice. Across town, Johnson faces his former colleagues one last time, cleaning out his locker. Officer Chen approaches with several others. "We want to help," she says. "What happened to you and Judge Carter? It made us realize we can't stay silent anymore." The center launches with unexpected support. Reform-minded officers join community activists. Police departments nationwide request guidance. The media dubs it the Phoenix model, a comprehensive approach to rebuilding police-community relations. 1 year later, Carter and Johnson stand together at the opening of the center's new headquarters. The building, formerly a defunct police substation, now houses training facilities, community meeting spaces, and offices for civil rights organizations. "When you tasered me in that park," Carter says to Johnson during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, "I never imagined we'd end up here." Johnson nods. Sometimes it takes breaking something to see how badly it needed to be rebuilt. The changes are tangible. Use of force incidents drop by 60% in the first year. Civilian complaints are investigated by an independent board. Body camera footage is automatically uploaded to servers outside department control. New recruits undergo extensive community engagement training. The final scene unfolds at a neighborhood park, the same one where Carter was tasered. A community police forum is underway, with officers and residents sitting together in small groups, actually talking. Children play nearby without fear. Elderly residents chat with beat cops they know by name. Carter and Johnson watch from a bench, two men whose collision course led to unexpected collaboration. A young officer approaches them, notepad in hand, eager to learn from their experience. "The hardest part," Johnson tells her, "isn't changing policies, it's changing minds." Carter adds, "And the most important change starts within ourselves." As the sun sets over Phoenix, The park fills with more residents and officers, gathering for a community dinner. The fear and tension that once defined these interactions has been replaced by something new: cautious hope. The local news captures this moment, not as breaking news or controversy, but as evidence of quiet, persistent progress. The camera pans across faces in the crowd: Carter, the judge who became an activist; Johnson, the officer who chose truth over loyalty; and dozens of others who refused to accept that things couldn't change. The story ends not with dramatic flourish, but with small victories. Another department adopting the Phoenix model. Another officer choosing to de-escalate rather than dominate. Another community beginning to trust again. It's not perfect, but it's progress. The kind that comes from people willing to stand up, speak out, and do the hard work of real change.